Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 22 of the Liberty Brief podcast. In today's podcast, Dr. Tom and I are going to question the wisdom of compulsory primary and secondary education. We're also going to look at how the grading system used in practically all colleges and universities produces mediocrity instead of excellence in our degree holders. And we're going to look at an alternative to this madness that Professor Mario Giordano, Dr. Tom's father, developed and offered way back in the mid-'70s. So hang on, and let's get ready for some interesting perspectives on American academia. America's founders are calling. It's your opportunity to respond. This is the Liberty Brief podcast with your host, Robert Melso, featuring Dr. Thomas Giordano. Hello, Dr. Tom. How are things going for you over there in Italy?
Hey, Rob. Everything is exactly as expected. We have an expression in Italian, eravamo meglio quando eravamo peggio.
Meaning?
Meaning we were better off when we were worse off.
I like that. It certainly applies to us in the U.S. as well. I don't think I have to go into too much detail explaining that.
No, it's not necessary.
Okay, Dr. Tom, I'd like to get into a few things that we didn't go over in our last episode, and maybe you can state clearly what we can observe from the history of education in the U.S., and then get into the solutions your father came up with in the 70s no less. So to briefly summarize, as you told us, the slow process of getting the federal government into the education system was spurred on by private associations for their own benefit, though those pushing this thing forward gave the public perception that it was for the benefit of our youth and the republic. The underlying mission, however, was to secure their own prestige and jobs. So the objective became compulsory education, ensuring an endless supply of students for educators to stand in front of with an ideology of conditioning compliant, obedient workers. The system they adopted was the lockstep Prussian model of education. Is that accurate so far?
Yes, it is. The whole system was up for grabs by whoever had the most to gain from it. The NEA and others set it up for their own job security and welfare. They pushed for it to become compulsory, and to do this, they legally neutralized the parents' unalienable rights to educate their children as they saw fit, and to determine what the kids were learning at the local level through the legal doctrine of in loco parentis. Since the Prussian model was ideated to produce efficient, obedient workers and soldiers, the industrialists, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and a few others, saw a great opportunity and wrested control by offering free education through their foundations. People like Rockefeller and the General Education Board used the facade of philanthropy to set policy, which was enforced by government edict. Rockefeller and others of his mindset are quoted as saying they didn't want a nation of thinkers, they wanted a nation of workers. Is it any wonder that the schools were set to run like factories with nice little rows of desks, bells ringing to mark the time and standardized testing? How about grading systems that punish kids and embarrass them through public or peer humiliation?
Punishing kids. That reminds me of a story about our cousin Anthony.
Oh, Anthony, yeah?
Yeah, he turned out to be an okay guy. Did pretty well, but when he was in grade school, 4th grade, he had a nose for trouble. He had a penchant for getting into mischief.
That's Anthony. I said it like the South Philly way.
Yeah, that's Anthony. We were both in parochial school, Catholic school, and anyway, the nuns there, they didn't take much shit, and they knew discipline. They knew how to discipline kids. And if you got in trouble, if you were disrespectful or you talked out of turn or did any one of a number of things, you could end up with your mouth washed out with soap. Well, back then, we were always marched in single file to the bathroom. One day, we were marched there. We were held up. We couldn't get in for some reason. Turns out Anthony was in there with a nun. He came running out with foam coming out of his mouth, her behind him with a ruler. One of the nuns turned to me. She said, "Is that really your cousin?" And I said, "Sister Lucius." "Yes, Sister Lucius."
Well, you couldn't deny Anthony. I could picture that easily, though, knowing him. Well, like you said, you and Anthony were in Catholic school. I wasn't. Parochial schools were the Catholic response to not having their kids indoctrinated with Protestantism in the government-run schools. I remember when I was in the second or third grades, we started each day with a school prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance. It was the Lord's Prayer, and I had never heard it in English before. I only knew it in Latin, but I could tell it was similar because of the cadence, I remember asking my father about it, and he told me, well, that was the King James version of the prayer, and to say it anyway because it couldn't hurt. So I had to learn it in English and in Latin, though the translation was not accurate.
Really? It wasn't accurate? How so?
Well, the Latin version, which was older, uses the word debita, which is, or debts in English, not trespass. Trespass wasn't the original, wasn't in the original text. It was debita, Afterward, in about 1964, the school prayer became a moment of silence and then eliminated altogether, but for the wrong reasons. But let's not go there. I remember I had a friend who was Jewish, and I couldn't figure out his dilemma. But poor, little Stephen Cohen, he's standing next to me. We're looking at each other, but for obviously different reasons.
Right. So, let's get back on track. Let's talk about the reasons the power holders give for their failures. Can you attempt to give us a brief summary of the typical responses to being called on the carpet for not attaining educational goals?
Oh, well, we've all heard it briefly. The government and the NEA's failures in education are always blamed on a lack of funding and support for teachers. Now, it is important to remember that they serve political interests. And from their point of view, the failures are not their fault and required the continued need for more funding and reforms that only they can provide. You know what I mean? In other words, they're the source of the problem, and they keep telling you that with more money we can we could provide the solutions. In reality, the NEA, for example, is a powerful lobbying group that seeks to maintain its influence and protect its members, even at the expense of students and in the face of their failures. They never address the subpar outcomes in our schools as a function of the compulsory system itself. The emphasis on standardized testing and the rigid education system has not proven to be effective in encouraging critical thinking and a love of learning, let's say. The one-size-fits-all approach to education does not consider the individual needs of students and their different learning styles. Also, using the metric of minimum standards will ensure just that, minimum outcomes. However, if their true underlying motives were known, that their actual progressive aim is based on the idea that the state plays a critical role in shaping and defining an individual's values and beliefs, and the compulsory education is seen as a means to guarantee that everyone receives the same education and the same interpretation of the world, then things become clearer. If their objective is to allow the state to exert greater influence over the beliefs and values of the population, then the social engineering and indoctrination of kids with a postmodernistic form of Marxism, is actually fulfilling their mission. The mystery it can easily be seen by the buzzwords they use, like accessibility, diversity, inclusivity, and critical theory, rather than academic outcomes of excellence and competence as a measure of the success of the system. It not only explains their failures, but also their continued existence as well.
All right, from what I can see, Dr. Tom, I can agree, I think, that centralized compulsory education has created a captive audience for the NEA. And this comes at the expense of parental rights. The legal doctrine of in loco parentis, which permits schools to take on parental responsibilities, has been used to justify these infringements, I guess. But that being said, I do think that parents should still fight tooth and nail to play an important role in their kids' education. I mean, they should be involved in their child's education, and they need to have a say in what they learn.
Oh, you're right. But today, government minions have categorized concerned parents as homegrown terrorists when they question the actions of their local school boards.
Well, that was one example. I'm not so sure that happens across the country, nor do I think that the NEA is reflective of all the teachers. My kids went to high school here in a suburb of Philadelphia, and they had a great education, and the teachers, I can't commend them enough. However, the centralized nature of this is all beginning to make sense now. And that explains some of the statements you hear from these jerks in government about how they're more qualified to decide what is being taught in school.
Yeah, well, isn't that clear enough? There may be exceptions along the way, but, we're still in the process. This has, let's say, evolved from the time we were in school. We could see it. We could see it changing.
Yeah. Well, another thing I've noticed is that the goal of the Prussian education system, which stressed discipline and obedience, like my friends over at the Catholic school, my cousin Anthony and I, they used to stress discipline and obedience, but that's been hijacked by progressives. Today, even discipline and obedience have been purged from the system. So no more swallowing soap.
Yeah.
In fact, to me, it seems that it merely foments discontent, a sense of entitlement, and, revolt against every pillar of Americana. In other words, education should really be about empowering individuals to think for themselves and to become self-reliant. As I mentioned, my kids here in suburban Philadelphia did very well, and I thank the school district for imposing discipline and at the same time staying in their lane, not forcing any ideology. And I'm very thankful. But from what I can see in urban districts and other places in the country, it's become a tool for imposing a political ideology on students.
Yeah, that's where we are. And this is particularly true in the humanities, like social studies and that kind of thing, where postmodernism has its most significant impact. These people are wordsmiths. They're word jockeys. That's all they're good for.
Well, we went over that a little bit in the last episode, but could you give our audience an idea of how postmodernism has contributed to the failures and dropout rates of our students?
Well, sure. First, it has led to the rejection of objective truth and facts. These are essential components of a quality education. Second, it has promoted a culture of victimhood and resentment, which can be extremely damaging to the psychological well-being and academic success of students. The link between these observations and failures in education outcomes is clear. The focus on political ideology rather than objective fact has led to a decline in academic standards and a lack of critical thinking skills among students. This, in turn, has led to an ever-increasing failure to meet educational goals. To my mind, the only way to fix our education system is to return to objective standards of achievement and focus on imparting knowledge and critical thinking skills rather than enforcing a particular political ideology.
Dr. Tom, talking about political ideologies, wasn't the Prussian education system used as the basis for political propaganda by the Nazis?
Yes. The Nazis did use elements of the Prussian education system as part of their propaganda machine. The National Socialists believed in the idea of an idealized Aryan race and used the education system to indoctrinate children into this belief. It was not present before the National Socialists came along. It was, it just wasn't a part of the German mentality. They used the education system to teach children anti-Semitic beliefs and promote the Nazi ideology. The Nazis also emphasized discipline, obedience, and militarism over individual growth and self-expression, which they believed was necessary to build a strong and unified society. The emphasis on conformity and obedience is similar to the approach taken by the Prussians, but for different ends.
Well, how come Mercedes-Benz are so nice then?
Well, that's technology. It's a different thing altogether.
Was this idea of repetition is the mother of learning, was that used elsewhere?
Oh, yeah, sure. It has been used universally as a tool for socialist and communist propaganda and re-education. To give a couple of examples, in China, the Communist Party has used this approach in their education system to indoctrinate children into the Marxist-Leninist ideology and to promote unquestioned loyalty to the Communist Party. This is done through a rigid education system that emphasizes uniformity and conformity. Did you ever see, images of the kids doing push-ups and calisthenics, all in a big line?
Yep.
And also the repetition of Marxist ideology as a means of political indoctrination. It's the same story in North Korea. The education system is heavily influenced by the government and is designed to promote unquestioned loyalty to the regime. Children in North Korea, from the time they could speak, are taught propaganda songs, from a very, very young age and engineered to revere the Kim family as infallible leaders. Again, this is accomplished through a system of political education that emphasizes rote memorization and repetition of propaganda. And we must never forget the Soviet gulags. In fact, we could cite all of the other Marxist-based and other authoritarian regimes that have come and gone, as well as the ones that are still with us. It's worth noting, however, that the use of repetition as a means of political indoctrination is not exclusive to left-wing regimes. It's just that it's more destructive when it's under a left-wing regime. It has been used by all political ideologies to some extent and can be a powerful tool for promoting loyalty and conformity. The underlying message determines whether it is constructive or destructive to society.
So you're saying like the Pledge of Allegiance?
Yeah, sure. Pledge of Allegiance.
Do they still say the Pledge of Allegiance in schools today?
I have no idea. But the way things are going, I would imagine not. It might offend somebody,
So you're saying that in and of itself, the method is neither good nor bad, but the message being sent is the problem.
Sure. Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, and John Adams promoting natural rights, freedom, and self-reliance are positive objectives. Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Hitler, Castro, Pol Pot, Allende, and many, many others. The list goes on forever. Pushing a dishonest promise of utopia based on an insufferable equality, theft, and servitude ain't so positive. The lockstep method of instruction is great for the military, for example. But that's about it. I can't see any other place where it would be, really a good idea.
I see your point. So let's change lanes a bit and talk about the internal workings of the education system. Aside from its lockstep nature, your father, Buster, was admittedly an expert in the material. What were his views on compulsory attendance, minimum standards, and the bell curve grading system found in most university classes?
Well, my father was not in favor of anything compulsory. He absolutely hated coercion of all kinds. He was in complete agreement with the idea of universal opportunity for a formal education, should a person desire one. He was even in favor of taking the decision away from kids to determine whether they wanted one or not. But there is a difference between a parent making the decisions for their minor children and people within the structure of a self-serving state monopoly making the decisions. As far as the compulsory nature of education, if students are not well motivated, not self-motivated, to be in the classroom of their own free will, what would you predict the results would be? I mean, how did you feel as a kid when your mom dragged you off to the store to buy shoes and clothing on a Saturday morning? I mean, think about it.
I'd defy anyone to say that there could be any other result. Boredom, mediocre or failing grades, failing to progress from one level to the next, perhaps rebellion, and eventually dropping out of school. But then the question remains, what are we to do with those kids? Should a child be allowed to make those decisions?
No, not at all. His parents should be allowed to make those decisions. But you have to look at the distractions these unmotivated kids create for students who are in the classroom for the right reasons in which to actually learn something. The distractions. I mean, the class clowns, the bullies, the school skippers, and the agitators. Now, think about another problem. Schools get funded by arbitrary results set by the government minions who want to demonstrate achievement that deflects from their failures. The bean counters don't care about anything other than getting the kids out the door with a piece of paper. So as their minimum standards get lower and lower, the diploma gets more and more worthless. It has become nothing more than a certificate of participation. If you don't believe this to be the case, go look into the staggering increase of remedial courses in the curricula of the first years of university to counter the lack of education their students got in high school. A bachelor's degree today probably has the same societal value as a high school diploma did in the 1950s.
I think we'll call that educational inflation.
No, it's
maybe it's deflation.
Well, it's educational mediocrity.
Oh, okay, so what happens to the remaining students? I mean, no matter how you look at it, they're all not equal in ability or understanding.
Exactly. Failing to recognize the differences in individual abilities and strengths leads to another problem in the lockstep system. The pace of the classroom instruction is as fast as the slowest person in the room. It's like driving a car with your foot on the brake pedal. While the teacher is concentrating on their inclusion, the rest of the kids are bored and looking out the windows.
Let's talk for a minute, Dr. Tom, about those minimum standards. I always wondered about lowering the bar for achievement. What were your dad's views on this?
He wasn't in favor of them, I could tell you that. Being an educator, he understood something that most people still don't get. He gave me a few of his observations a long time ago. One was what he called the 10-10 rule, okay? He said that only 10% of a given subject could be covered in a given semester, and only 10% of that could be tested. So think about it. The grading system was based upon 1% of the body of material being taught. Even on an absolute scale of 0 to 100, a 70% passing grade actually reflects 70% of 1%. Would you consider that a level of understanding that could be competently applied? Incidentally, probably the only good thing about the lockstep system was grading compared to an absolute scale. This was another thing that postmodernists destroyed with their relativism.
I think you're talking about the bell curve.
Yes, the bell curve.
All right, let's break that down a little bit for the sake of our audience. Why don't you describe the bell curve and its effects?
Sure. The bell curve method promotes the idea that academic achievement should be evenly distributed across a group of students, which is an unrealistic and harmful approach. Students are graded on a curve based on the performance of their peers, the other students, rather than an absolute standard. On the one hand, this means that even if a student has achieved a high level of competence, they may receive a lower grade if their peers perform even better. This can lead to a sense of unfairness and a lack of motivation among students. On the other hand, if you're a slacker and just trying to get by with the minimum, any better achiever is a threat because they skew the curve to the right, lessening your grade even more, you know?
I remember. I'm not going to tell you which category I was in, but I remember the arguments when the test scores came out. There was sometimes some resentment. It seems like the bell curve pretty much rewards mediocrity and incompetence.
It certainly puts kids on the road to redirecting their efforts to gaming the system rather than achieving excellence.
All right, Dr. Tom, I know your father was a critic. He was a critic of all these things from my own discussions with him. Now, I know the answer to the next question, but I'd like you to describe his solutions to these problems. As a premise, your dad was way ahead of his time with this. We're talking about his solution from the 1970s, even earlier, in the 50s, if I remember. Dr. Tom, could you elaborate that for our audience?
Well, given what we've just gone over, there are a few things that have to be said as premises beforehand. Any solution is based on identifying the problem. He started from the grassroots. No matter which system a kid was being educated under, whether it be formal, non-formal, or informal, nowhere is anyone taught how to study. It's just not taught in school. And believe me, learning is a skill that must be learned and mastered. Now, my dad told me something that has never left my mind. The only difference between a genius and an average person is the length of time needed to master a given body of knowledge. All right? Now, remember that. If the average guy masters the subject according to his own pace of learning, in the end, he will arrive at the same level of competence as the genius.
All right, hold on, Dr. Tom. Before we go on, I'd like to inform the audience that this episode is timely, especially for us, because the revised edition of your dad's book, How to Study and Master Any Subject Quickly, is being released as we speak, and it contains 8 simple, fast-learning methods that your father devised to teach his students how to learn. For anyone interested, there will be a link in the description below. In its first release, it was a bestseller in the UK for more than 2 years, and its Italian translation was a bestseller in Italy for about the same amount of time.
Oh, my God, a shameless plug.
Well, I had to do that, Tom. Okay, why not? So let's continue. I never thought about that observation about geniuses before it was explained to me. I think your dad, he made a good observation there. So he started with individuals rather than the system itself. In other words, he analyzed what?
Well, he investigated many theories and sources as to why students fail to perform. He also made some observations firsthand of his own. He was eclectic in this study and drew from many sources like B.F. Skinner, even L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology.
Yes, L. Ron Hubbard. I had a friend comment on the working draft of the book that's being released. And frankly, he had an objection to Hubbard's name being mentioned.
Who cares?
Right.
We're not talking about any supposed controversy related to Scientology itself. We're looking at how they teach, not what they teach. It's interesting that nobody ever criticizes the lockstep method of forcing political dogma into our kids' heads, though they may not agree with the dogma itself. So it's not what's being taught, it's how it was taught. In any case, my father realized everything came down to identifying a few simple, obvious but ignored common obstacles to learning, and then mastering a few simple methods of learning. He tried these methods out by taking on the worst performing troublemaking students in the high school where he taught back in the late 50s and early 60s. The parents and administrators were stunned by the significant improvements in scholastic outcomes of his students. They also noticed a marked increase in self-worth and enthusiasm among the students when they began to see their grades improve. Their attitudes changed completely.
Okay, so the first problem he addressed was the fact that nobody is taught how to learn. As you said before, he came up with a way to do that with his students. Now, what about the education systems that he developed over his career? I remember from your book, Unalienable, that you gave a brief biography of his life. In your book, you spoke about him developing what was called distributive education as a high school teacher in South Jersey in the early part of his career. What was that?
He initiated and promoted a concept that aimed to integrate academic study in the classroom with on-the-job work placement. We were in the post-World War II baby boom era, and America was rebuilding the world. Industrialization was still the name of the game, and most kids were directed into the trades rather than into the professions. So to continue to meet the needs of industry, he devised a way for employers to be assured that these newly graduated high school students had job entry skill sets worth employing, to avoid a lot of wasted time and money in training on the part of the employer, and made these kids assets to their companies as soon as they walked in the door. So it was a benefit to everybody involved, and it worked. It worked well.
So he first came up with the method to meet the needs of the individual students, and then he turned his efforts to reform the lockstep system?
Yes, it was a gradual transition, but yes. Over the next decade, he gradually started to merge the information he was gathering. His efforts with distributive education grabbed the attention of the school district superintendent, and he was offered a position in the administration. He left the classroom, but he was dropped right into a corrupt political morass and couldn't stomach it for very long. Fortunately, the private industry also took notice of him. The Radio Corporation of America, RCA, was looking for someone with his exact competence to design educational systems for the electronics industry. It was here in the private sector that he learned more about education than he did in his formal education. He was charged with designing a course in teaching the Fortran and COBOL languages for the newly emerging need for computer programmers in government and industry. He also designed an educational system for RCA to teach Micronesians electronic engineering and construction.
And having read your book, he went back to the classroom. For the sake of brevity, he was now at the newly founded College of Camden County, New Jersey, and he continued his research to design an alternative to the Prussian system for both the formal and non-formal education. It was there that he developed the non-lockstep educational system, or NLSES, under a grant from the federal government. So that was a big thing, too.
Right, that's right, in 1975. He pronounced it NILSIS. He abbreviated NILSIS.
Right. And if I remember, along the way, he also designed and implemented a program for business similar to the distributive education model called the Junior Business Partner Program.
Yeah, he also created the very first 6-month course for African American studies, called the African American Civilization course, along with a professor of history, Dr. John Stewart III, for the federal government. He and Dr. Stewart were the very first people to create an African American study course. I have to say, though, that it was NILSIS that he was most satisfied with because it offered a truly novel alternative to the Prussian system.
Perhaps it would be best, Dr. Tom, if you briefly describe NILSIS and tell our listeners how your father envisioned it as a positive alternative. But I have to remind you, I think we're running low on time.
Okay, I'll try to be brief, but still do it justice. The non-lockstep education system is just that, non-lockstep. It was conceived to give instructions at the pace of the individual learner rather than forcing everyone to follow a rote course. All right? Basically, a given body of knowledge is broken down into small chunks of information, usually containing a maximum of 5 pertinent facts. These are called modules. The student isn't given a time constraint on each model, but must complete them with a 100% correct score when tested. They may then pass to the next module and so on in a sequential order until all are completed. The benefits are that the completion guarantees a perfect grade. No need for the bell curve or the more insane pass-fail grading system, because even the bell curve is a failure. It eliminates competition between students, other than to see who can complete the course the fastest. Also, it changes the role of the teacher to a true guide to teaching and gives them the ability to zero in on misunderstood facts and correct them on the spot. It also makes the assessment of the student's progress completely objective and eliminates any subjectivity on the part of the educator.
I can see the benefits right off the bat. Having students learn at their own pace would help alleviate the feelings of boredom or frustration often associated with the current system. Also, by eliminating the bell curve method of grading, students would no longer be compared to one another, but would instead be assessed based on their own individual progress and achievement. This would promote a sense of self-worth among students and encourage them to focus on their own academic growth rather than competing against their peers. Overall, by implementing a student-centered approach to education that's focused on say, individual growth and progress, we can expect to see perhaps a significant improvement in scholastic outcomes. Students would be more engaged, motivated, willing to take risks, and that might help nurture the intellectual curiosity that's essential for academic success.
Right. Now, it is unlikely that we can get rid of compulsory education. However, in and of itself, it can be a good thing. Okay? But when all is said and done, teaching students to excel in their studies doesn't assure that they are not being taught a load of crap. Any organized system can be corrupted by people. Just necessarily just changing the system wouldn't do us any good if you didn't get rid of the ideology underneath the system. You see what I'm trying to say?
Right. Okay, so perhaps another shameless plug. I think we could direct your people to the book Unalienable if they want a fuller understanding of the mechanics of what your dad was trying to achieve. But in the meantime, I think there are many other things inherent in the present system that have to be addressed, besides teaching kids how to learn and changing the system under which they're learning.
No, there's no question. There's no question.
By the way, Dr. Tom, aren't charter schools right now subject to the same state or district mandated curriculum standards as public schools? Also, they need to apply for and can lose their charter for noncompliance. So they're not really free to teach at will.
Yes, and so are the parochial schools. The curriculum is determined by the state for accreditation, but there is a way to rectify all of their control. I've discussed this in the past with my father many times. Number one, let's list them. Number one, you can eliminate federal involvement and its support for the NEA. All right, that's number one. Number two, take away federal taxes as a carrot to comply with their mandates. Take that out of the equation. Number three, return to state and local control. Accreditation and degree granting authority is already at the state level. Number four, a diploma or a degree given in one state has to be accepted by all the other states in the Union under Article 4, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Full faith and credit, all right? And that states that full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. That means that when you get a degree from in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, let's say, that degree granting authority comes from the Commonwealth. And every other state has to recognize that as a public act and record. All right? So what you're doing is that the secondary school curricula and standards should be set by the tertiary schools within their own jurisdiction. In other words, the minimum standards across the board for secondary education should be determined by tertiary colleges, and it should be based upon the most stringent standards for entrance. So if you want your students in Pennsylvania to be able to apply to, let's say, Princeton in New Jersey, you have to look at Princeton's, requisites for entrance and use that as a basis, regardless of what the requisites for entrances into universities in your own state are. Okay? There are plenty of ways to organize this, but the real culprit behind all of this is the NEA at the primary and secondary level. The colleges and universities are another matter. The most important thing we can do is recognize that those in control have undermined accountability and rigorous standards in education while promoting a culture of relativism and entitlement within our education system. They have been more focused on protecting the interests of their members rather than serving the interests of the students and their parents. Instead of putting responsibility for educational outcomes solely on teachers who are swamped with bureaucratic regulations and standardized testing, we must shift the focus back to the local communities, parents, and individuals responsible for the child's education. As a result, the NEA must either change its mission to prioritizing educational outcomes of students or find itself increasingly irrelevant as people demand access to better educational opportunities outside of its influence.
Yes, well, everywhere you look, you can see that the NEA has prioritized inclusivity over competence for students. I suppose due to the influence of progressive ideologies.
Oh, yeah, sure. That's because they believe that inclusivity means providing all students with an equal access, but negates rigorous standards for students in favor of pushing politically correct agendas that ignore objective truth and the importance of competence. The NEA's emphasis on inclusivity also means that they prioritize the interests of teachers over those of the students and parents. I have to keep reiterating that. And they would rather maintain the status quo to appease their members rather than embrace innovative approaches to education that can help students succeed. This bias has led to a decline in the standards of education and pushed students towards an entitlement culture rather than a culture of hard work and discipline that provides value to society. It is important to recognize that the NEA has not lost sight of the true purpose of education, which is to equip students with the knowledge and skills necessary to become productive members of society. They never had it. Instead, their focus on inclusivity has undermined this purpose and led to an erosion of competence in educational outcomes.
All right. What about compulsory education? What can we do about that?
Well, it's there, and I don't think we should do anything about it, even though the present system is chock full of problems. To my mind, the objective should be to eliminate the system that it is attached to. As I said before, the NEA insists on compulsory education as a means to control the education system and to ensure its own relevance and importance. While the claim that the aim of compulsory education is to provide more extensive educational opportunities for children in the broader society, the NEA's control has led to indoctrination, partisan politics, status quo maintenance, centralization, and a lack of accountability, all of which have contributed to less rather than more helpful outcomes in education. I would say get rid of the NEA, and you would eliminate most of those problems associated with compulsory education today. You see,
Well, I'm not sure how we'll do that.
we could figure that out. Some of the ways I just mentioned before. Anything built by people can be overcome by people.
All right. Well, I hope you're right, Dr. Tom.
Well, we'll see.
I have my doubts in this instance, at least. I think they're a big organization. They've got a lot of political power.
Oh, sure.
And we might be in for a big run for our money here.
Oh, sure. Ronald Reagan faced it. Ronald Reagan faced that wrath. He tried to eliminate the Department of Education. Saw it as dangerous. It became a cabinet level department under Jimmy Carter in 1979, and Reagan wanted to eliminate it. He couldn't. 2.5 million people in a pack is a lot of people to fight.
Yeah, you don't want to piss off 2.5 million voters.
Well, it's not necessarily just the voters. 2.5 million Democrats. You'd have the entire Democrat structure against you because, these are the people that are behind all of this.
All right. Well, we're going to have to end here. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but it was a very interesting analysis. I hope our viewers got a lot out of this. And so let's talk about the next podcast. We're going to be discussing the two views of America. What are the differences between conservative view and the liberal view? And why are we so conflicted? Why can't we seemingly agree on anything? We have some thoughts on that. And in the meantime, I want to thank you, Dr. Tom, and we will see you next time. You've been listening to the Liberty Brief, based on the book Unalienable, What It Really Means and Why It Matters by Dr. Thomas Giordano. If you want to help spread the word, please subscribe, like, and share using the links below. You can also check out Dr. Giordano's book on Amazon using the links as well.